Millionaire single dad sees Waitress teaching his nonverbal son to speak. What he does next changes her life forever. The rain came down in torrents, drumming against the windows of the small-town diner. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the mostly empty booths. Only a few stragglers nursed their coffee cups, watching the storm rage through the glass. Stephen Brooks pushed open the door, the bell above jingling half-heartedly. Water dripped from his long coat as he guided his 5-year-old son Oliver inside. The boy clutched his hand tightly, his wide eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar, noisy environment. "Table for 2, the waitress behind the counter called out, her voice warm but loud enough to make Oliver flinch. Stephen nodded curtly and steered Oliver toward a booth near the window. He helped the boy into the seat and slid in across from him. Oliver immediately began to rock slightly, humming under his breath, his small hands flapping once, then again. Stephen leaned forward, speaking softly. "It is okay, buddy. Just breathe. We will be out of here soon." The clatter of dishes from the kitchen made Oliver startle, and then a loud laugh from a nearby table pushed him over the edge. He let out a high-pitched scream, scrambled out of the booth, and fell to the floor. His arms flailed, and he began hitting the ground, overwhelmed and inconsolable. Stephen moved instantly, trying to pick him up, murmuring soothing words that barely registered against the chaos. Before he could lift Oliver, a figure dropped down beside them. It was a young woman, wearing a stained apron and an exhausted ponytail, but her face was calm, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly, pulling a laminated picture card from her pocket and holding it up, a cartoon of a smiling face with the word "breathe" printed underneath. Oliver froze, staring at the card. His flailing slowed. The woman placed her hand on her own chest, exaggerating a deep breath in, then out. She tapped the picture again, smiling gently. Oliver mimicked her motion, taking a shaky breath. Stephen watched, stunned, as his son calmed down enough to sit up, his small body trembling but no longer in a full meltdown. The woman, Hannah, according to her name tag, smiled at Oliver and offered him a soft rubber toy from her apron pocket. Stephen's shock hardened into anger. "What do you think you are doing?" he barked. Hannah looked up, startled. "I was just," she began. "You do not get to touch my son without asking," Stephen snapped, his voice cutting through the diner. Heads turned. "I was trying to help," Hannah said, frowning. "He was overwhelmed. I have seen it before. I thought—" "You thought you would swoop in and play hero? Pity the poor artistic boy and his incompetent father?" Stephen's voice was sharp, brittle with something deeper than anger. Hannah's cheeks flushed. She stood slowly, the picture card still in her hand. "I was not pitying him," she said, her voice steady. "And I was not pitying you. I was trying to speak his language when you could not." Stephen's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you know anything about him, about us?" he ground out. "I know enough to see a boy who is scared," Hannah said quietly, "and a father who is too angry to see past his own pride." The words landed like a slap. Stephen opened his mouth to retaliate but stopped himself. Oliver, still sitting on the floor, was looking up at him, wide-eyed, silent. Hannah knelt again, ignoring Stephen, and spoke softly to Oliver. "You are doing great, sweetheart," she said. "Really brave." Oliver reached out a tentative hand toward the rubber toy still lying near. He grabbed it, clutching it tightly to his chest. Stephen swallowed hard, feeling the judgmental stares of the other diners pressing in around him. "Get up," he said to Oliver, his voice rough. Oliver obeyed, sliding back into the booth with the toy gripped tightly in one hand. Stephen tossed a crumpled bill onto the table and turned toward the door. Hannah watched them go, her heart aching. She had seen it before, the frustration, the helplessness buried under anger. She knew it too well because she had lived it herself once. She blinked rapidly, forcing back tears. Stephen pushed the door open into the roaring night, barely noticing the rain that pelted him as he guided Oliver back to the car. Inside the diner, the murmur of conversation resumed, but the tension lingered. Hannah picked up the laminated picture card from the floor and wiped it off with the corner of her apron. "Poor kid," she whispered. She glanced at the door again, but they were already gone. She did not expect to see them again. She certainly did not expect that this brief, disastrous meeting would be the beginning of everything she had ever dreamed of and everything she had ever feared. The rain had stopped by the next afternoon, leaving the streets slick and glistening under a weak winter sun. Stephen Brooks sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, his hands tight on the steering wheel as he waited for the light to change. Oliver was buckled quietly in the back seat, humming a soft, tuneless song under his breath. Stephen stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, but his mind was a million miles away. He had not been able to shake the encounter at the diner. Hannah's words echoed in his head, sharper than he cared to admit. A father too angry to see past his own pride. He hated how close to the mark she had hit. He had spent the whole night convincing himself he had been right to snap at her, that no stranger had any right to step into his son's world without his permission. But deep down, a gnawing guilt had taken root, growing with every hour that passed. Oliver had calmed for her. Oliver had smiled at her. That reality was harder to swallow than any bruised pride. The light turned green, and Stephen eased the car forward. As they rolled past the diner, he caught movement in the rearview mirror. Oliver had turned in his seat, pressing his small hand against the window, peering back toward the familiar red sign. Stephen frowned. It was not the first time. Every time they passed the place, Oliver's attention locked onto it, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something, or someone. Stephen shook his head and kept driving. At home, the afternoon unfolded in its usual quiet chaos. Oliver stacked blocks in careful, color-coded towers. Stephen answered emails, paced the kitchen, made half-hearted attempts at conversation that went nowhere. But the image of Oliver's face, lit with that tiny flicker of hope, would not leave him alone. That night, as Stephen tucked Oliver into bed, he found a small scrap of napkin clutched in the boy's hand. A crude, childish drawing, stick figures, a smiling woman with a big messy ponytail, and a little boy beside her. Hannah and Oliver. Stephen sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "You like her, huh, buddy?" he said quietly. Oliver did not respond with words, of course, but his face said enough. His smile was small, shy, but real. Stephen felt something twist deep in his chest. It had been months, no, years, since Oliver had shown that kind of spontaneous joy around someone new. Stephen brushed a hand through Oliver's soft hair, his throat tightening. Maybe he had been too harsh. Maybe Hannah had seen something in Oliver that even he had overlooked. The next day, as they drove into town, Stephen watched Oliver carefully. Sure enough, as they passed the diner, Oliver leaned against the window, eyes scanning the parking lot with a quiet yearning. Stephen tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He did not want to admit it. He did not want to need help. He did not want to let anyone, especially someone who barely knew them, into the fragile, carefully controlled world he had built for his son. But he could not deny the truth. Hannah had made an impression. Not just on Oliver, on him too. He exhaled slowly, turning the car down another street, away from the diner. His heart thudded heavily in his chest. He was not ready to face her, not yet. Not when he could still hear the echo of his own angry voice ringing through that small diner, cutting down the only person who had reached out with pure kindness. He needed to think. He needed to be sure. But in the back seat, Oliver tapped his little hands lightly against the window, humming softly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, and Stephen realized, with a sinking inevitability, that it was not about him at all. It was about Oliver. It had always been about Oliver, and maybe, just maybe, the boy deserved the chance to chase that small, fragile hope, even if Stephen himself was terrified of what it might cost. The days dragged on, and the weight of guilt pressed heavier on Stephen Brooks' shoulders. Every evening he watched Oliver retreat deeper into himself, his energy fizzling away like a dying spark. The little boy who had once stacked blocks and danced to cartoons now sat listlessly by the window, staring out as if waiting for someone who never came. Stephen tried everything he could think of. Trips to the park, new toys, favorite foods. Nothing worked. Oliver's smiles became rarer, his humming softer, almost mournful. It gnawed at Stephen worse than any sleepless night. On a chilly Saturday morning, Stephen watched from the kitchen doorway as Oliver sat cross-legged on the living room rug, clutching the worn napkin with the stick figure drawing. His tiny thumb traced the image over and over, his lips forming a wordless murmur. Stephen knew what he had to do. He hated it. He hated the way it made him feel like a failure, as a father, as a protector. But Oliver was slipping away, and if he did nothing, he would lose him completely. Stephen grabbed his coat, his mind already racing with excuses he would tell himself later. This was for Oliver, not for Hannah. It had nothing to do with her. The diner bell jingled as he pushed through the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and bacon. A few regulars looked up but quickly returned to their meals. Hannah stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee machine, her ponytail swinging as she worked. She did not notice him at first. Stephen hesitated, his pride clashing violently with his desperation. Then he cleared his throat. Hannah looked up, and her body tensed the moment she saw him. For a long beat, neither spoke. Stephen swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice low. Hannah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded toward an empty booth. Stephen slid into the seat, feeling awkward and out of place. Hannah stood across from him, arms crossed defensively. "I am not here to fight," Stephen said quickly. "Good," Hannah said coolly, "because I do not have the energy." Stephen forced himself to meet her gaze. "My son," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "Oliver. He has not been the same since that night." Hannah's face softened slightly. "He misses you," Stephen said. "He looks for you every time we drive past this place. He smiles when he sees brown hair." He exhaled sharply. "He drew you." Something flickered in Hannah's eyes, something tender but cautious. "I was wrong," Stephen admitted, the words scraping against his pride like sandpaper. "About you, about what you were trying to do." Hannah said nothing, waiting. "I am asking," Stephen said slowly, "if you would. Come spend a little time with him. One afternoon, no strings, just see him." Hannah blinked, visibly caught off guard. "You want me to babysit?" she asked, half incredulous. "No," Stephen said quickly. "No, just be there. Talk to him, however you did before." Hannah hesitated, her heart pounding. She should say no. Every instinct told her to stay away. She had her own troubles, her own fragile world barely held together. She did not have room for rich men with broken hearts and bigger egos. But then she thought of Oliver's face, the way his small hands had fumbled for the picture card, the tentative smile he had given her, and she remembered what it felt like to be needed, even in the smallest way. "I do not know," Hannah began, voice uncertain. "Please," Stephen said, and the rawness in his voice startled them both. Hannah glanced toward the kitchen, where her boss was shouting something about a broken fryer, toward the windows where rain threatened to fall again, toward the future she had long stopped believing in. She looked back at Stephen. He was not begging, he was not commanding, he was simply a father asking for help, stripped of all the armor he usually wore. "When?" she asked softly. Stephen exhaled, relief flashing across his face. "Tomorrow afternoon. At my place?" Hannah bit her lip. "Okay," she said finally, "but just for a few hours." Stephen nodded. "Thank you." As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "And Hannah?" he said. She looked up. "I am sorry. For what I said?" She gave a small, tired smile. "Just do better," she said. Stephen dipped his head and left without another word. Hannah watched him go, her heart pounding for reasons she could not quite explain. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned back to the counter, pretending her world had not just tilted slightly on its axis. In the back of her mind, though, a small voice whispered, maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Sunday afternoon arrived, cloaked in hesitant sunlight. Stephen stood by the living room window, arms folded, watching the driveway with a knot of tension lodged in his chest. Oliver sat cross-legged on the floor, lining up a row of toy cars with meticulous care. Every few seconds he glanced toward the front door. Stephen checked the clock again. Hannah was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago. He was beginning to wonder if she had changed her mind when a small, battered sedan rolled into the driveway. Stephen exhaled slowly and moved to the door. Hannah stepped out, a canvas tote slung over one shoulder. She wore jeans and a faded blue sweater, her hair pulled back loosely. She looked different here, out of place but somehow fitting, like a splash of real life against the muted tones of his carefully controlled world. Stephen opened the door before she could knock. "Hi," Hannah said, a little breathless. "Hi," Stephen replied stiffly, stepping aside to let her in. Oliver's head popped up at the sound of her voice, his eyes widened, and a smile broke across his face, small but unmistakable. "Hey, buddy," Hannah said warmly, crouching down to his level. She pulled a small laminated card from her tote, showing a picture of two hands forming a sign. "This means friend," she said, signing the motion as she spoke. Oliver stared at her for a moment, then slowly, clumsily, mimicked the gesture. Stephen felt something catch in his chest. Hannah grinned. "Perfect," she said. Stephen hovered awkwardly by the doorway, feeling like a stranger in his own house. "Where would be good for us to work?" Hannah asked, standing. Stephen gestured toward the spacious living room. "Here is fine." Hannah nodded and sat cross-legged on the floor, unpacking a few more cards, a small whiteboard, and a set of brightly colored markers. Oliver edged closer, curiosity lighting up his features. For the next hour, Hannah worked with Oliver, showing him simple signs paired with pictures and sounds. She spoke slowly, clearly, never raising her voice, never rushing him. She clapped and cheered softly whenever he got something right. Stephen watched from the kitchen doorway, his heart in his throat. Oliver responded in ways Stephen had never seen before. He pointed, he nodded, he even tried to mimic sounds, his little face scrunched in concentration. At one point, Hannah drew a simple house on the whiteboard and signed home. Oliver tapped the picture twice, then looked up at her and smiled. Stephen felt a prick behind his eyes and blinked it away. He knew he should be grateful, and he was, but along with the gratitude came a sharp, unexpected pang of jealousy. For so long, it had just been him and Oliver against the world. They had their own clumsy rhythm, their own silent language. Now, here was this woman, this stranger, breaking through the walls he had never managed to breach. Stephen swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay back, to let it happen. Then, something extraordinary happened. Oliver stood up, clutching the whiteboard in his small hands. He crossed the room and tugged insistently at Stephen's sleeve. Stephen knelt down automatically. Oliver held up the board, his face shining with excitement. Stephen looked. On the board, scrawled in uneven but unmistakable letters, were 3 simple words. "I like Dad." Stephen's breath caught painfully. He looked at Oliver, at his bright, eager eyes, and felt something inside him shatter and heal at the same time. "You did this?" he whispered. Oliver nodded proudly. Behind them, Hannah watched with a soft smile, her heart swelling. Stephen pulled Oliver into a fierce hug, burying his face in his son's hair. "Thank you," he mouthed to Hannah over Oliver's head. She gave a small nod, blinking back tears. For a few moments, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of breathing, the fragile, precious quiet of a new bridge being built. When Oliver finally pulled away, he grabbed Hannah's hand too, tugging her toward Stephen, as if trying to close the circle. Stephen hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. It was warm, steady, real. They stood there, connected by a child who had once been locked inside his own silent world and was now, step by step, finding his way out. Stephen realized something else then, something that filled him with both hope and fear. He needed her, not just for Oliver, but for himself. The thought terrified him, and yet he could not look away. Later, after Hannah packed up her materials and promised to return next weekend, Stephen stood by the door and watched her drive away. Oliver pressed his nose against the window, waving his small hand. Stephen smiled, but deep inside, a seed of unease took root. He had spent so long being everything for Oliver. Protector, teacher, voice. What if? What if Oliver did not need him the same way anymore? What if Stephen was the one left behind? The fear whispered in his ear, dark and insistent. He pushed it down. For now all that mattered was the joy in his son's eyes. For now all that mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, their world was expanding, and maybe, just maybe, there was enough room in it for all three of them. The following weeks slipped into a soft rhythm. Every Sunday, Hannah arrived at Stephen's house, her tote full of teaching materials and her smile brightening the entire space. Under her gentle guidance, Oliver blossomed, mastering new signs, stringing hesitant words together, laughing more freely than Stephen had ever seen. Stephen watched it all with a strange mix of wonder and growing vulnerability. He told himself it was fine, but the more Hannah became part of their lives, the more Stephen realized he was relying on her. Not just for Oliver's progress, but for the way she softened the sharp edges of their once lonely world. Not everyone saw it that way. "You need to be careful," Julia, Stephen's sister, warned one rainy afternoon as they sat in his kitchen. "You barely know her." Stephen frowned. "She has been good for Oliver." "Or maybe she sees an opportunity," Julia said, setting her cup down hard. "Rich, lonely, single dad, vulnerable kid. It happens." Stephen bristled but said nothing. Still, her words gnawed at him. Julia, unwilling to leave it alone, quietly hired a private investigator. When she received a short, stitched-together recording, Hannah talking to a co-worker about money and Stephen's wealth, Julia felt justified. Without hesitation, she forwarded it to Stephen. Later that night, Stephen listened to it alone in his office, the room swallowed by darkness. "He is rich. If I play this right, maybe I will not have to worry about money ever again." The words slithered into his ears, cold and damning. Stephen sat frozen, disbelief, battling heartbreak. Was it all a lie? The laughter? The way Oliver lit up around her? The following Sunday, Stephen waited by the window, arms crossed tightly. When Hannah's car pulled into the driveway, Oliver squealed, running for the door. Stephen stayed rooted in place. When Hannah stepped inside, her face lit up at the sight of Oliver. "Hey, little man," she called, ruffling his hair. Stephen's voice sliced through the room. "We need to talk." Hannah blinked, startled. "Okay," she said, setting her tote down. Stephen strode across the room, pulling out his phone. He hit play. The distorted, cruel version of Hannah's voice filled the space. Hannah's face paled. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" Stephen snapped. "Was any of it real? Or was it all just about the money?" Oliver stood between them, sensing the tension. "No," Hannah said, shaking her head, desperation rising. "Stephen, it is not what you think." "Then what is it?" Stephen demanded. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you used my son to get to me." Tears filled Hannah's eyes. "You think I would use Oliver?" she choked. "You think I could—" "I think you should leave," Stephen said coldly. Oliver whimpered, clutching Hannah's sleeve, confused. Hannah knelt, her voice breaking. "You are so brave, little one. Do not ever forget that." She kissed the top of his head and stood, her hands trembling. Facing Stephen, she said quietly, "I thought you were different. But you are just another man who sees only what he is afraid to see." Without waiting for his reply, Hannah grabbed her tote and fled into the gray afternoon. Stephen stood motionless, the phone still in his hand. Oliver whimpered again, tugging at Stephen's pant leg. "Dada!" he whispered, his voice full of confusion and heartbreak. Stephen knelt and scooped him up, but Oliver wriggled away, running to the door, pressing his small hands against the glass, staring at the empty driveway. Stephen slumped back on his heels, numb. The house felt unbearably hollow. He told himself he had protected his son, protected their fragile world, but deep down an aching truth gnawed at him. He had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The days that followed were darker than any Stephen Brooks had known. Oliver barely spoke, even with the few signs he had mastered. He no longer reached for his toys, no longer smiled when cartoons flickered across the television screen. He sat by the window most of the day, holding the worn napkin drawing of him and Hannah, staring out as if hoping she might still appear. Stephen tried everything: favorite meals, trips to the park, new toys. But Oliver remained distant, locked behind walls even higher than before. At night, Stephen sat awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the look on Hannah's face as she had walked away. It had not been anger, it had been heartbreak. And in the moments when Stephen was brave enough to face it, he knew the heartbreak was not just hers, it was Oliver's too. One afternoon, as rain misted against the windows, Stephen sat at his desk, mindlessly scrolling through emails he could not focus on. His sister Julia had sent another message, this one titled, "More info on Hannah." With a sigh, Stephen clicked it open. Attached was a link to a longer audio file, the original unedited recording. For a long time, Stephen simply stared at the screen. Then, with a shaking hand, he hit play. Hannah's voice filled the room again, but this time the full conversation was different. "So, how is the new gig?" the coworker asked, laughter in their tone. "It is not a gig," Hannah said, her voice firm but tired. "It is just this little boy. He is amazing. I do not even know if I am helping him, but when he smiles at me—" She trailed off, emotion thickening her words. "It feels like maybe I am doing something good for once." "And the dad?" the coworker teased. Hannah laughed softly. "He is complicated, but he loves that kid more than anything. I would not touch that trust for all the money in the world." The coworker chuckled again. "Still, nice that he is rich, right?" Hannah's reply came swift and sharp. "Money does not fix anything. Not what he is going through, not what that boy needs." Stephen sat frozen, the blood draining from his face. The words echoed in his ears, erasing every ugly assumption he had let take root. He had not just doubted Hannah, he had betrayed her. He had betrayed Oliver. Stephen shoved his chair back violently, pacing the room like a caged animal. His hands shook with anger, at himself, at Julia, and the way he had let fear rule over trust. He thought of Oliver's small hands pulling at Hannah's sleeve, of the first time Oliver had smiled without prompting, of the way he had signed "friend" with clumsy pride. All gone now, because of him. Stephen scrubbed a hand over his face, sinking onto the couch as a heavy, inescapable guilt settled on his chest. In trying to protect his son, he had shattered the first real connection Oliver had ever built outside their tiny, isolated world, and Oliver knew. He knew something had been broken. That night, Stephen tried to coax Oliver to eat, but the boy simply shook his head and turned away. Stephen knelt beside him, feeling helpless. "I am sorry, buddy," he whispered. "I am so sorry." Oliver did not respond. He only hugged the crumpled napkin closer to his chest. Stephen sat down heavily against the wall, dropping his head into his hands. For the first time in years, he cried. Not the silent, hidden tears he allowed himself when no one was looking. Real, gasping sobs that left him raw and empty. He cried for his son. He cried for the woman he had hurt, and he cried for the man he had become, the one too afraid to believe in something good when it was offered freely. When the tears finally stopped, he wiped his face and looked at Oliver. The little boy met his gaze, solemn and steady. Stephen nodded slowly. "I am going to fix this," he promised. "I am going to bring her back." Oliver tilted his head slightly, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. It was the only answer Stephen needed. The next morning, Stephen made the calls he should have made weeks ago. He confronted Julia, furious and unrelenting, forcing her to admit to her manipulations. She apologized, but the words tasted hollow. This was not something he could undo with an apology. It was something he had to earn back. Stephen packed his small bag, just essentials, and strapped Oliver into the back seat of his car. As he pulled out of the driveway, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. He did not know exactly where Hannah was, but he would search every diner, every coffee shop, every roadside motel if he had to, because she was not just someone Oliver needed. She was someone they both needed, and this time he would not let fear steal that chance away. Stephen drove for hours, the world outside blurring into endless stretches of cracked asphalt and dim neon signs. He stopped at every roadside diner, every crumbling motel, asking the same question. "Have you seen her? Brown hair, about this tall, kind smile." Most shook their heads. Some barely looked up. Oliver rode silently in the back seat, clutching the worn napkin drawing. His presence grounded Stephen, reminding him why he could not give up, even as exhaustion clawed at him. By nightfall, they rolled into a tired little town skirting the highway, its main street lined with flickering streetlights. Stephen's eyes scanned the storefronts until they landed on a dingy bakery, Maggie's Pies, its windows fogged with steam. Through the glass, he caught a glimpse of a woman in a flour-dusted apron. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. It was her. Without thinking, he parked, grabbed Oliver's hand, and pushed through the bakery door, the bell above jingling weakly. The warm scent of cinnamon and sugar wrapped around them, but Stephen barely noticed. Hannah looked up, freezing when she saw them. A tray slipped slightly from her hands. Before Stephen could speak, Oliver let go and ran across the room, arms wide. "Home!" he cried, voice clear and sure. Hannah gasped, dropping the tray with a clatter. She dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, and Oliver barreled into her embrace. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she hugged him tightly. Stephen stood frozen, every bottled emotion crashing over him. Hannah pulled back slightly, cupping Oliver's face in her hands. "You said a word," she whispered, voice trembling. Oliver nodded solemnly, burying his face against her shoulder. When Hannah looked up, her eyes met Stephen's. No words were needed. Everything was said in the forgiveness and overwhelming love shining between them. Stephen crossed the bakery in 3 long strides, kneeling beside them. His hand brushed against Hannah's as he stroked Oliver's hair. She did not pull away. Instead, she smiled, a raw, breathtaking smile, and Stephen knew in that instant he could not lose her again. The words came without thought. "Marry me," he said, his voice rough. "Right here, right now. No big speeches, no second chances, just marry me." Hannah blinked, stunned. Her hand tightened around Oliver's, tears glistening in her eyes. "Stephen," she breathed. "I know I am not perfect," he said hoarsely, "but you're the best thing that ever happened to me. To him, to both of us." A broken, joyful laugh escaped her. She wiped at her cheeks. "You do not even have a ring," she teased, voice trembling. Stephen grinned for the first time in what felt like forever. "I will get you one tomorrow. 10 if you want." Hannah looked down at Oliver, who watched them with wide, hopeful eyes. She cupped Stephen's face gently, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." Stephen pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as Oliver squeezed between them, giggling with delight. Outside, the rain fell softly, blurring the town into a watercolored dream. Inside, under the flickering yellow light and the smell of warm bread, a broken family found itself again. And this time, nothing, not fear, not pride, not even the past, could tear them apart. They stayed like that for a long time, laughing and crying, holding each other, as if the rest of the world had fallen away. Eventually Maggie, the elderly bakery owner, peeked from the kitchen with a bemused smile. "You gonna buy a pie or what?" she teased, hands on her hips. Stephen laughed, wiping his face. "2 pies," he said, "the biggest you have." Maggie chuckled and disappeared back into the kitchen, humming. Hannah leaned against Stephen, her head resting on his shoulder. Oliver nestled warmly between them. Stephen kissed her forehead, feeling her sigh against him. This was it, not the life he had once imagined, not the life he had clung to out of fear. Something better, something real, something earned. As he sat there, surrounded by the 2 people he loved most, Stephen understood something simple and true. Home was not a place, it was a feeling, and he had finally found it. Spring unfolded gently across the countryside, painting the hills with wild flowers and draping the sky in endless blue. Nestled between the fields was a small farm, its white fence newly painted, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of new beginnings. Stephen Brooks stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the morning unfold. Inside, laughter echoed, a sound once foreign to him, now the rhythm of his life. Hannah had turned the old barn into something beautiful, a center for children like Oliver called Hope Haven. Parents came from miles around, drawn by stories of miracles. They never knew Stephen was the silent benefactor who had bought the land, paid every bill. It was Hannah's dream brought to life, and he was happy to stay in the background. Oliver thrived here. Gone was the boy who cowered in corners. Now he ran freely through the fields, his laughter carrying on the breeze, speaking more with each passing day. Today was not about therapy or renovations. Today was about family. The wedding was simple, exactly as they had wanted. No grand venues, no endless guest lists. Just them, the land that had cradled their healing, and a handful of people who mattered. Stephen adjusted his tie nervously, glancing down the path, and saw her. Hannah walked barefoot through the grass, a crown of wildflowers resting on her head, her dress flowing with the breeze. She looked like she had stepped from one of Oliver's drawings, soft, radiant, breathtaking. Oliver ran ahead, clutching her hand tightly, his face beaming. Stephen's heart swelled so full he thought it might break. They met under an ancient oak tree, its arms stretched wide like a blessing. Maggie from the bakery, who insisted on officiating, stood waiting, grinning over a thick, battered book. "Ready?" she whispered. Stephen and Hannah exchanged a look, laughter bubbling between them. No words were needed. They were already home. The ceremony was short, sweet, and perfectly imperfect, Oliver interrupting to hand Stephen a dandelion, the wind tugging Hannah's hair, Maggie forgetting half her speech and laughing through the rest. It was perfect. When Maggie finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Stephen needed no encouragement. He leaned in, kissing Hannah with a love so fierce and sure, the world seemed to tilt beneath them. When they finally pulled apart, Oliver clapped his hands, giggling, and then, in the hush that followed, Oliver looked up at Hannah with bright, solemn eyes. "Mom," he said clearly. The world stopped. Hannah gasped, dropping to her knees as tears sprang. Oliver launched himself into her arms and Stephen dropped down beside them, wrapping them both into a tangle of laughter, tears, and unstoppable love. They stayed there as the light faded, as the sky deepened to a soft velvet blue. Later, they sat on the porch swing, Oliver curled asleep between them. They watched the stars blink into being, the air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh earth. Then, with a sudden sweep, a shooting star cut across the sky, burning bright and fierce against the night. Hannah caught her breath and pointed. "Look," she whispered. Stephen followed her gaze, smiling. "A wish?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "No," she said, "a promise." Stephen tightened his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Whatever comes," he murmured, "whatever storms, we hold on to this." "This," Hannah echoed, brushing her fingers through Oliver's hair. "Our messy, beautiful, imperfect family." Stephen closed his eyes, feeling the truth of it settle deep into his bones. They had been lost, they had broken, they had almost given up. But love, real, stubborn, imperfect love, had stitched them back together in ways he had never dared to dream. He looked down at the two people he loved most, their faces glowing in the soft starlight. Home was not a place, it was a feeling, and they had finally found it. Above them, the shooting star burned out, leaving the vast, endless sky, and three steady hearts beating stronger together than they had ever been alone. In a world that often feels overwhelming, where hope can seem just out of reach, Stephen, Hannah, and little Oliver remind us of a powerful truth. Family is not about perfection. It is about love. It is about standing together through the storms, healing the broken places, and building a home from laughter, forgiveness, and second chances. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful journey of healing, trust, and unconditional love. If stories like this touch your heart and remind you of the resilience we all carry within, we invite you to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Here, we share tales that inspire, heal, and celebrate the extraordinary power of human connection. Stay with us for more real, emotional stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, may you always believe in the beauty of second chances.